Hi friend, it's your host Emily Matheson and welcome to New York Transplants, the podcast. On this podcast, I connect with other transplants to better understand how we can find human connection and build community in this concrete jungle. As a mental health expert, I am always looking for new ideas and tools to support my sense of belonging and well-being. In this first episode, I share my transplant journey and what inspired me to buy a camera, press record, and start a podcast. This solo episode is a little different to the following guest episodes, where I'll be leaning on other transplants and asking for their advice on how I and you can nurture our New York roots. So what are you waiting for? Come and get rooted with us. Picture this. It's January 27th, 2024 in New York, and it's 15 degrees outside. That's Fahrenheit or minus 10 degrees Celsius. The kind of cold that stings your eyes and chaps your lips. I have just returned to Manhattan after spending 3 weeks in Australia for Christmas, and now I have a home visit hangover. It's Saturday morning and I'm sipping my coffee on the couch in an empty apartment. My husband, Dan, is away for work and other New Yorkers are hibernating. It's safe to say that my social calendar is looking a little bleak. It's a stark contrast from the summer hues I left behind in Australia. On this particular Saturday morning, I feel somewhat isolated in a city that is and isn't quite my home. I'm also frustrated with myself because I feel that I should be somewhat immune to this feeling, or at least know how to handle it by now. After all, I have been here for 2.5 years and I have a background in mental health. So, as I pour my second cup of coffee on that Saturday morning, I decide that I have marinated enough in my self-pity and I force myself to sign up for a spin class in the East Village. I trek 11 subway stops and plonk myself onto a stationary bike surrounded by mirrors and other hibernating New Yorkers. And as I pedal to keep up with those 50 other cyclists, I can't help but watch their reflections in the mirror and wonder, how many of them are transplants? How many of them have felt this way? How many of them have felt pulled between two homes? How many of them have a sense of community here? Maybe I could talk to these other transplants. Maybe I could ask for their advice. Maybe I could share what I learn. Maybe I could start a podcast. No. Now, picture this. It's August 22nd, 2024, and I am in fact recording my first episode of New York Transplants, the podcast, where I aim to explore the nitty-gritty truths about how visiting and living in New York are two very different experiences. So if you care to, join me as I ask other New York transplants for advice on how to cope with being a transplant and how we can create a sense of community in this concrete jungle. But first, I'm getting way ahead of myself. Let me explain how a spin class in the depths of a New York winter made me think that I should pick up a microphone and press record. And trust me when I say I don't leave every spin class with these grandiose ideas. Hi, I'm Dr. Emily Matheson, but friends and colleagues typically call me Em or Emily, and I am what New Yorkers affectionately call a transplant. I vividly remember the first time I heard the phrase transplant. It was in 2019 when I was living in the UK. I was FaceTiming my long-distance boyfriend who was living in New York, and he was talking about his brother's girlfriend who was quote unquote a transplant from Michigan. And my first reaction was, that is a weird thing to call someone, followed by this graphic image of a heart in a surgeon's hand. And for some reason, I immediately thought, well, bodies typically reject new organs, especially hearts. Just watch an episode of Grey's Anatomy. Fast forward 3 years. I am now living in New York with that long distance boyfriend who is now my husband, and I am a New York transplant from Australia. I was born and raised in Adelaide, Australia, and moved to New York after living in Bristol, England for several years. I moved to England in 2018 for a new job, then made another transcontinental shift to New York in 2021, but this time for love. So technically, I am a 2 times transplant. And while I might wear this transplant badge with honor, it does have its downsides. Homesickness and home visit hangovers being two of them. I coined the term home visit hangover back in 2022 when I was trying to explain to my husband, Dan, how it feels to settle back into New York after spending an extended period of time in Australia. When you visit your native city or country, you're typically spending quality time with your parents, siblings, childhood friends, and you're surrounded by familiarity, whether that's your favorite coffee spots, food brands, or accents and languages. And this familiarity brings with it comfort and offers a sense of belonging. It's then time to say goodbye and return to your second home. So whenever I return to New York, I usually hold two sets of emotions, excitement and sadness. I am excited to be back with my husband, living in a city with a rich tapestry of colors, cultures, and opportunities. But I'm also sad about leaving Australia and what I miss out on by living in New York. So when I'm settling back into my New York life and routine, I usually tell my husband, just bear with me this week. I'm going to have a little hangover. To which he responds with extra cuddles, space to talk or not talk, and my personal cliche favorite, a pint of Van Leeuwen's cookies and cream ice cream while we binge watch some new series. The problem is, much like a regular hangover, I've noticed that my home visit hangovers are getting worse with age. It feels hard to pendulum swing between these two homes and to settle back into my New York life and routine. I can't help but reflect on and compare my Adelaide and New York lives, particularly my communities and sense of belonging. Don't get me wrong, the past 2.5 years have been an exciting life chapter. I have an amazing husband who comes from a great family who we see regularly. I have a couple of friends in the city and I have a fulfilling job that allows me to work from home. What's there to complain about? With that said, on any given week, 90% of my relationships are digital, whether that's conference calls with colleagues or FaceTiming friends and family. So I guess you could say that whilst I'm blessed with an international community, which is a privilege, my local community of New York needs some tender loving care. And when you're in the midst of a home visit hangover, your mind can play tricks on you. You might think in extremes and make unfair comparisons. You might find yourself thinking things like, I don't belong here. It would be easier back in Australia. I'm missing so much back home. And this is exactly where my mind was at on the 27th of January before I trekked to that spin class. There I was, sitting in front of the heater in our empty apartment, having a little pity party for myself. And Dan was away. And so it would have been very, very easy to keep marinating in my self-pity. But I was also tired of feeling this way. So I put my psychologist hat on and asked myself, what do I need at this moment? Not necessarily what do I want, what do I need? And I needed to end the pity party. I needed to get outside of the apartment, no matter how icy the footpaths. And I needed to do something that was familiar, comforting, and enjoyable. And in psychology, we call this behavioral activation. Behavioral activation is a really simple but effective therapeutic technique for when you're experiencing low mood, such as bouts of anxiety or depression or home visit hangovers. And it's based on the principle that engaging in meaningful and positive activities can improve your mood, energy, and motivation. But the key is to start with small, manageable, and achievable activities. So that's when I stopped doom scrolling and opened the ClassPass app and saw that my favorite spin instructor, Angie, had a class that day. And she would be celebrating her 1000th ride. So it was safe to say that I'd be dragging my sad little butt to a place where I felt welcomed and where the vibes would be good. So I focused on those 1% details that would help my energy and my motivation for getting to that class. So I decided to make a cup of coffee to go. Yes, even for a 20-minute trip. And yes, it was my third cup of coffee. I slicked back my hair into a high bun, lathered my lips with Vaseline, and put on my sleeping bag winter coat with my noise cancelling headphones and Natasha Bedingfield on repeat. I really lent into the basic bitch bubble because it's familiar, it's comforting, and it's enjoyable. And after 11 subway stops, the blistering cold was met with the warmth of the cycle bar staff, who immediately said, "Where have you been? It's been ages." And perhaps this was a simple statement to them, but it was a statement that signaled I belonged. I entered the studio and saw Angie's beaming face in between these gold balloons that spelt out 1000. Now, Angie has the energy of a professional cheerleader and the wisdom of a 50-year-old therapist. And in true Angie style, she used her 1000th ride to reflect on her journey to this milestone, including finding her New York community through Cycle Bar. She told of her story from moving from the Midwest to New York, which I've learned is a very common migration path for early career Americans. And she talked about the trials and tribulations of packing up her life and moving to New York, only to have to move back to the Midwest because of COVID. And then she attempted move number 2 and has been in New York ever since. And it was only minutes into the spin class that Angie used the word transplant. And instead of a bloody heart, she described this process of uprooting herself from the Midwest to New York. And all of a sudden, a new image came to my mind. Instead of a bloody heart in a surgeon's hand, I pictured a tree being delicately dug up, traveling from one destination to another, and planting those roots into a new environment. And I couldn't help but think about this replanting phase. It's not as simple as arriving, unpacking your boxes, and visiting Central Park, and boom, you're home. This process can take months, even years. It also requires a lot of nurturing and patience and self-compassion. And it's not always easy for our roots to take hold and flourish, especially when you're in a concrete jungle. A jungle that can make you feel both invincible and invisible within the span of 20 minutes. So as I was pedaling and sweating and trying to keep up with Angie, my mind was wandering and thinking about my own transplant experience. My mind went to conversations that I'd had with friends and family leading up to that spin class. And during those conversations, I noticed that I was becoming that person who couldn't stop bringing up their ex-boyfriend, except my ex-boyfriend was the desire for community in New York. I was weaving it into conversations with my husband, my parents, my friends, and it was an ongoing theme in my own therapy sessions. During these conversations, I was shocked by how many people had experienced this longing for community, both here in New York as well as back in Australia and England. And this isn't surprising, given that we're experiencing a loneliness epidemic. Digital relationships and communities are at an all-time high, while physical social connections and communities are dropping off a cliff. But what I found particularly interesting was, like me, my friends and family loved the idea of community, but they also had difficulty defining what community meant to them. They just knew that it was a nice idea and that it felt good to belong to one. There was also a recognition that the concept of community has changed and evolved in the last 2 decades, for better or worse. Now, let me be clear. Homesickness and this desire for community ebbs and flows. I love and appreciate my New York life. It's a privilege to have 2 homes and to be able to travel safely between the 2. A privilege that not everyone has, and that's definitely a conversation for another episode. I'm also not constantly curled up in a ball, disconnected and unwanted. I've noticed patterns. The feelings are strongest, of course, after trips home to Australia and when I miss out on big friend and family events such as births and weddings. The other pattern I've noticed is that I can go weeks and months without even thinking about it. I string together quality time with my husband, coffee dates with New York friends, family and work events. And before you know it, it's been 3 months since my last bout of homesickness. But then a life event happens, which leaves you feeling wobbly and in need of support. And you think to yourself, would this have been easier if I had my Adelaide community around me? Now, back to that fateful spin class. In addition to using words like transplant and uprooting, Angie said something along the lines of, you can't wait for that thing to happen to you. You need to go out and grab it. So, as I was pedaling my legs to a remix of Noah Kahan's Stick Season, I started to consider, how do I take Angie's advice? How do I reach out and grab onto community in New York? I continued thinking and pedaling, and I kept coming back to the word transplants, more specifically New York transplants. My mind then went to all the ways I like to learn and solve problems. I am a verbal processor, if you hadn't noticed, which means that I prefer to talk through my ideas and problems. I get this from my mum. Shout out to Pammy. So what better way to work through my transplant experiences than talking with and learning from other transplants? Better yet, I could share these conversations in hope that our chats may help other transplants. Cue the podcast epiphany. The spin class couldn't end quick enough. Sorry, Angie. It felt like I'd been struck by lightning and I couldn't wait to workshop the idea. As soon as the class ended, I turned back into Michelin woman in my sleeping bag winter coat, lathered another layer of Vaseline onto my inevitably chapped lips, dodged the icy footpaths, and bunkered down on the subway. I Googled the phrase New York transplants and drumroll, nada, nothing. Okay, not technically true. The search results just weren't what I was expecting or what I wanted. The top search results were all about heart, liver, or hair transplants, which are incredibly important, but have nothing to do with the fostering of community in New York. I then searched the term New York expats, and there were some really good resources, but they were all about the logistics of relocating to New York. For example, what visas do you need, the top 5 neighborhoods, and how to submit your taxes. I then took to Instagram and Apple Podcasts and Spotify. And again, there were no resources that spoke to the mental health aspects of belonging and creating community in New York. Now, don't get me wrong, podcasts such as The Happiness Lab with Dr. Laurie Santos, or How to Fail with Elizabeth Day, or Unlocking Us with Brene Brown, just to name a few, they do a great job of speaking to the concepts of loneliness, belonging, and community. And we can and should apply those podcast learnings to our New York experience. But there weren't any specific resources that discussed what it means to be a New York transplant and how and where to create a community in this beautifully chaotic city. The reality is there are many communities in New York. Our city is a rich tapestry of color and cultures that have open arms for new and returning faces. But the reality is it takes time to build familiarity, and it takes courage to step into those spaces and show up time and time again. As I mentioned, in addition to being a transplant, I have a PhD in clinical psychology. And for the past 6 years, I've been developing mental health and well-being resources for young people around the world. And when I'm facing a problem, both personally and professionally, I research. Knowledge gives me comfort. So after Googling New York transplants, the natural next step was to research the concept of community. And during my research, I read that when you're trying to build up your sense of belonging, you should reflect on the roles that you've previously played in other communities. And when I reflected on this, I noticed that across many relationships, both personal and professional, I've been the sounding board, the friend or colleague who provides support, advice, resources. I pride myself on being useful. So why not lean into this role when it comes to my new and undefined New York community? It sounds cringy, cliche, but I want to be a thread in the tapestry that helps connect other New York transplants with people and places where they can feel a sense of belonging, a sense of community. Cue New York Transplants, a little corner on the internet that is talking about how living in New York is very different from visiting and how we can nurture our roots in a concrete jungle. This podcast is not going to solve the loneliness epidemic, but it may help someone feel that little less alone, particularly on days when their inner homesick dialogue is off the charts. This season, I'll be speaking to numerous guests who I admire, all of whom have very different backgrounds, whether that's their origin of city or country, ethnicity, culture, or profession. But what they all have in common is that they are New York transplants in one form or another. They'll be sharing their transplant journey along with tips and tricks that they've tried, also highlighting what's helped or hindered their progress in becoming more rooted in New York. In addition to guest episodes, I'll also do some solo sessions where I share some of my experiences. And for our fellow nerds, I'll be sure to weave in some facts, figures, and psychology concepts. So, without further ado, welcome to the New York Transplants, the podcast. Come get rooted with us.